Chapter 10. Tenga Sharoo. When they finally reached dry land, the fisherfolk took very good care of their surprise catch. Delilah, Morphea, Dominator and Tepid were almost force-fed a warm breakfast, and tucked into one large bed so firmly they couldn't move if they'd wanted to. The fisherfolk's house was a single-level dwelling split into 3 rooms. The first and largest room was for cooking and having long, fast-spoken conversations. The second was full of tools and fishing gear, and was where their boat was stored away out of bad weather. The final room was a bedroom, packed with enough cushions and rugs to build a second house. It was late in the afternoon before their hosts were convinced their quarry had recovered enough to be allowed out of the bed. This was just in time, too. Being encased in a bed, all 4 of them together, was not an easy experience, especially when one of them was claustrophobic and another had a very short temper. As soon as she was released, Morphea engaged the fisherfolk in a hurried conversation, finding out everything they needed to know to get themselves back to the ship. It wasn't long before she rejoined the others who, being far less multilingual, hovered by the door of the room.
"Our best chance is to travel across to the nearest town,"
Morphea reported.
"There should be boats there. We might be able to get our hands on one and try to rejoin the others as they travel from Oola."
"Indeed, I don't doubt Captain Oola will insist our companions keep their heading to the islands to refit and resupply," Tepid agreed.
"And we can't just borrow the fishing people's boat?"
asked Delilah half-heartedly, but Morphea shook her head.
"They've done more than enough for us already. We can't ask any more of them." "So, how far to the town?"
said Dominator, keen to get moving. Morphea hesitated a moment, and his face fell.
"Oh no, how long?" 5 days' walk,"
said Morphea. There was an unhappy pause. One of the fisherfolk shuffled up behind them, holding up a pair of walking boots with a wise smile.
"Guess we'd better get cracking then,"
sighed Dominator, rolling up his sleeves and seizing the boots. They wished they could give better thanks to their hosts for their generosity. They were complete strangers with absolutely no way of repaying the fisherfolk for their efforts, and yet these people treated them like family. It made Delilah remember ever after that good hospitality was one of the simplest but most remedial acts of kindness, and it always made her bristle when people took it for granted. Waving a final goodbye, Delilah followed the others up the slope rising away from the house. This sat in a solitary position on the edge of the scrubby coastline, the gentle hush of the waves still just audible behind them. The rain was soft today, but had long since drenched their path. Loose stones kicked by their new boots jumped into the puddles that laced their route with a hollow plopping noise. Delilah was already out of breath by the time she caught up with her companions. Taking a moment to ensure she didn't appear like the adventuring novice she was, she tried to stroll easily up behind them, but ruined the effect with a loud gasp as her eyes met the land lying ahead. Grey stone and mud. That was all there seemed to be in every direction, with gashes of sullen brown grass that stretched intermittently beneath one of the widest skies Delilah had ever seen. What they were looking at had once been the famous, cold desert of Tenga Sharoo, full of stone, scrub and dust. That was before the unnatural rain had swept in, turning its vast plateaus into marshes, intertwined with streams, bogs, and drowned plants that couldn't drink the water fast enough.
"Ready for a walk?"
said Dominator with a wry smile. The fisherfolk had advised them to cut away from the coastline, slicing straight through the sodden desert land on the shortest route to the town. Though the going underfoot wasn't easy, and the rain was as persistent as ever, what really stuck in their minds was that ominous number. 5. 5 days to reach the town. Who knew where the ship might be in that time? The thought of missing it, or the sailors' confusion if they came searching while the 4 of them were still halfway across the desert, made them all stride out as fast as they could. More troubling still was the landscape itself. For all its simplicity, it was having a strange effect. Except for the occasional skeletal bushes or trees, its unchanging nature began to trick them into thinking they were making great progress, and then revealing it to be no distance at all. Only Morphea was able to keep a straight line, tracking the sun behind the clouds and letting the daylight guide her path. There was no shelter for their camp that night, and the ground was far too damp to light a fire, but the fisherfolk had given them a large lantern, filled with an oil made from thick-rooted plants they grew in their garden. It burned gentle and slow, even as, one by one, they fell into brief, restless sleep. The second day continued much the same as the first, but with a colder, more uncomfortable night's sleep at the end of it, sheltering under a dead bush which fell on them in the middle of the night. Delilah had never woken up so early as on that chilly third morning. The light in the sky was so fresh and pure, it seemed the skin of night had only just that moment been peeled away. It made her feel sick and wobbly, and the cured fish they ate for breakfast didn't help matters. They set off a lot slower that morning, sniffing from the damp and shivering through their wet clothes. Tepid's hair had never looked more miserable. The unchanging horizon began to make them nervous as they squelched along their path. None of them spoke much, and Delilah soon found herself retreating into her own mind. She thought about the others, and about how much safer she'd feel back at home in Fealdnor, but the mud sucking at her boots served as a reminder that things wouldn't be much better there. If she wanted Fealdnor to be saved from turning out like this desert, she would have to grit her teeth and keep going, even if she really didn't know what she was doing. If only she'd known that despite the bravado, the assured confidence and the loud talk, none of her friends knew what they were doing either. They just had to do what felt right, and trust that, somehow, they might just manage, as they had on adventures past. Delilah's stomach growled unsteadily, and she wished she had Bligh with her. Even though she knew he'd get wound up worrying about their situation, she was sure if he was there she would feel better. The wind picked up. Tepid looked over his shoulder and saw Delilah had fallen behind.
"Rather breezy, isn't it?"
he called, waiting for her to catch up.
Yes. Thank you, Your Highness, sir,"
panted Delilah, not quite sure how she should be addressing the Prince of Nausea. Tepid leaned down to her level. "You know, having travelled this far amongst you, been stranded at sea, rescued, and now trekking across a thoroughly unhappy desert, it is safe to assume I am off duty as Prince right now."
Of course, sir?"
"Fair Sovereign will do just fine."
"Oh."
Delilah flushed and apologised, but Tepid shook his head, smiling. "I was making a small joke, Miss Delilah, as you seemed rather glum."
"Oh."
"Can I presume you are suffering from cold sickness, homesickness, lack of blue ghost sickness?"
"And fish sickness,"
said Delilah, her stomach adding another vocal complaint. "Ah, well, I do believe we are all feeling much the same," said Tepid, removing an obtrusive strand of hair from across his face. "Though I must exclude the obvious heartache towards your dear ghost. I mean, truthfully, Aluiciuous isn't a bad fellow under all that blueness, but I don't think I really feel quite that way about him." Delilah snorted in spite of herself. A bit too hard, actually, and hastily wiped her face on her sleeve. Something began to appear in the distance on their left. It was at least a mile away when they first spotted it, but as they drew closer, the ground climbed upwards, and they could see a collection of towering rocks, carved by time and winds into a cluster of interlinked chimneys, each laced with holes. The wind was stronger now, and as it blew, the rocks hummed with a thronging chord, filling the open air with strange sounds almost like music, sometimes faint, and then sometimes loud as flurries of gusts swept through them.
"I decree we rest here tonight,"
said Dominator.
"We should keep going,"
objected Morphea.
"No offence, Morphea, but I've known you not to sleep for days when you're set on something,"
the prince replied.
"But if I don't have a dry night's sleep, I will go mad and probably do something that will embarrass everyone."
Dominator said it like he meant it. Morphea soon realised she would be outvoted, and settled for scowling at him while he climbed to the nearest hole in the rock. Most of these were too small, even for him, but eventually they found a sheltered alcove midway up one of the towers of stone. It was still very chilly, but it was dry. That night the wind became a rushing gale that whistled and whined around the tall rocks, driving the thin sheets of rain mercilessly across the wide plains around them. Even Morphea had to admit she was glad they stopped when they did. Dominator was already working up a magnificent cold, and his competitively loud sneezes punctuated the din, rattling the stone above them. Delilah didn't feel so well, but it wasn't caused by the cold or their meagre supper. She'd been feeling strange and lonely all evening. Most of all, she missed Bligh. Part of her knew he was absolutely fine, but another part of her didn't listen to the first part and worried about him terribly, even though there was no obvious reason why. A third part was slowly realising if she wanted to overcome these feelings, it would be up to her to cheer herself up. But it wasn't easy. She wriggled a little further into the alcove, curling up tighter. She needed Bligh to be there, being his usual calm self, daydreaming and making daft comments. But he was on his own adventure. Delilah knew she couldn't expect somebody to act in a particular way just to make her feel better. People were their own people. Tepid shuffled over, having given up trying to subjugate his hair, which was unlikely to willingly return to its tame, well-behaved state any time soon. "Still a little queasy."
"Tired,"
Delilah replied, rubbing her eyes. Tepid thought she looked utterly dreadful, but was too much of a prince to tell her, off-duty or otherwise.
"I miss Geo too,"
she said quietly.
"But no one said being in love with someone is this much work. There's never any mention of how much you worry, how heavy it feels when you can't be with them. All the stories paint it as happily ever after, but..." She curled up tighter. "I miss him, and it actually hurts. Love is strange, isn't it?"
Tepid gave her a peculiar look, and, for a brief moment, the usually well-concealed cogs of his mind could be glimpsed turning.
"Love? I don't think I have the right to speak on the subject," he said thoughtfully. "But I will say... Yes, I think there is a far wider scope to it than most dear people think. Romance, that's just one of its many forms. Love is infinitely more complex than, say, kissing a princess and riding away into a well-placed sunset, as it is so often promoted. And if you make that particular missold notion as your only summit worth climbing, the only goal where all other dreams end and life completes itself, you will be missing out on a very great deal." He smiled kindly, and the curtain closed on the cogs before Delilah could quite process what he'd just said. "Besides," he stretched, "this hardly seems like the time for all this introspective stuff. I'm on holiday—" Dominator sneezed. "We're on an expedition," Tepid continued. "And I believe you mentioned you were tired. I will let you get some rest." He gave her a pat on the arm and toddled back to his corner of the alcove. But Delilah didn't rest that night. Strange goings-on were happening all around the high chimneys in the dark. The wind rushed in a swirling torrent through the black desert sky, and queer voices whispered through the whistling stone. Opening a sleepless eye, she could see the makings of a thunderstorm brewing far away across the empty land. Every now and then the clouds lit up in distant purplish-white flashes, though there was no thunder to be heard. Delilah rolled over in another attempt to capture some elusive sleep, but her heart began thumping in her chest. The wind grew ever stronger. When she opened her eyes again, the storm had travelled a remarkable distance, and was now hanging almost right above them. One flash almost blinded her, and she shut her eyes tight. When she dared to reopen them, she thought she saw Morphea sitting high on top of their chimney, the wind blowing all around her. She seemed to be talking, but it was too dark and the noise of the wind too loud for Delilah to make out the words. The sky flashed again, and the noise of the thrumming stone, the roaring gale, and the eerie whispers made Delilah cover her ears. As the invisible chaos howled around them, another blaze of violet light illuminated Morphea as she stood up, still making her case to the air, and then pointed right at Delilah, who stayed frozen where she lay, not daring to make a sound. Morphea seemed to be able to tell Delilah was awake, because she did a little double take, paused mid-flow, and then beckoned to her. Not at all sure if she was seeing things right, Delilah got up and clambered over to Morphea, squinting through the black, rushing air, trying not to step on either of the two princes who were, miraculously, asleep. Reaching down, Morphea pulled Delilah up to where she stood on top of the rocky tower. The gale was fiercer than ever at this height, and Delilah felt herself shaking,
not knowing where to look.
"It's all right,"
called Morphea over the noise.
"They're the Wind Lords. Say hello." Hello?"
Delilah shouted weakly into the air. The wind rushed towards them, stealing her words away. Her voice was swept up into the dark, clouded air where whispers surrounded her words, listening to them with invisible ears. Then snatches of soft, song-like voices drifted back to her through the confusion, like a fond greeting to a long-unseen family member.
"This is the White Queen's daughter,"
Morphea called.
"What I've told you is true."
The whispers whirled past once again, though Delilah still couldn't see anything in the dark except the violet flashes of light flaring through the clouds.
"They're going to help us,"
shouted Morphea, turning back to Delilah.
"Wake the others."
Delilah scurried back down the rock, and soon the two princes were standing, bewildered but alert in the dark. Morphea pulled them up on top of the rock to where she stood, the wind rattling their clothes and tugging their hair across their faces.
"No, leave the lantern,"
she shouted through the din.
"We have to hold hands. Don't let go and don't question anything. Just do exactly as I tell you." "Why are we awake?"
yelled Dominator.
"I can't see a thing." "It's better that way. Remember, don't let go."
Delilah felt Morphea take hold of her hand in a vice-like grip and heard her voice beside her.
"Now start walking."
"Which way? There's no room," someone spluttered.
"Don't ask a single question. Step forwards now."
Delilah felt Morphea pulling her. All of her wanted to resist, her heart tumbling in her chest. There was a 30-foot drop all around them. They were going to plummet down any second. But Morphea was too strong. Delilah had no choice. She screwed up her eyes tight, held her breath, raised her foot, and stumbled off the rock into thin air. They kept walking. The wind was so strong Delilah could barely draw breath again. Morphea was somewhere in front, pulling her forwards by her hand. Dominator was gripping so hard to her other hand Delilah thought her fingers were going to snap. The force and the wildness of the inescapable torrent of air was terrifying. It was like standing underneath an immense waterfall with her face turned upwards into the flow. All was darkness, scorched by the searing bursts of purple light. Time lay shredded behind them. Where they were, how long they walked, how much longer Delilah could keep breathing, all was torn to pieces in the invisible chaos. Was it a trick of her mind, or was the noise growing a little softer now? The onslaught of air on her face was lessening. Her head was swimming, but she could almost open her eyes. The next thing Delilah knew, she was slowly lifting her head from soft, damp mud, taking in heavy, shuddering gasps of cold air as the gentle light of day trickled through the spitting rain.